The Thornfield dining room held 14 guests, and Agnes Waring sat at the lower table where she had not sat in 3 years. She sat beside Sir Philip Calder, not beside the Duke of Thornfield where she had always sat during working dinners. And the displacement felt like standing in a familiar room after the furniture had been rearranged. Philip asked about the dispute resolution method the Thornfield Tenant Society used, and Agnes explained with the authority of the woman who had designed it, her voice clear and precise as she described the quarterly review process. Philip laughed at something she said about a farmer who had argued his boundary dispute using a surveyor's map from 1703. And Agnes laughed back, the sound carrying across the candlelit room like a bell. At the head of the table, the Duke of Thornfield's hand tightened on his wineglass. The stem snapped. Wine spread across white linen in a dark stain that crept toward the edge of the table. The young noblewoman beside him gasped with a sharp social laugh that made the accident into an anecdote. Mrs. Parr, standing at the sideboard with the second course, met the Duke's eyes across the room and recognized what the broken glass meant. The Duke did not look at his hand. He looked at Agnes. Agnes had not noticed. She was still talking to Philip, her hands gesturing as she explained the tenant fund allocation system. And the fact that she had not noticed was worse than the laugh, worse than Philip's attention, worse than the wine soaking into the cuff of his coat. Mrs. Parr crossed the room with a cloth napkin and a basin. She knelt beside the Duke's chair and began collecting the broken glass, her movements efficient and silent. The Duke allowed her to blot the wine from his cuff without speaking. His gaze remained fixed on Agnes, who was now answering a question from the gentleman on Philip's other side about crop rotation schedules. She spoke with the same precision she always used in the estate office, the same clarity she employed when writing the Duke's letters, the same confidence she had earned over 3 years of managing a program the county believed belonged to the man at the head of the table. Philip leaned closer to Agnes and said something the Duke could not hear. Agnes nodded, her expression thoughtful, and replied in a voice too low to carry. Philip smiled, not the polite smile of a dinner guest, but the genuine smile of a man who had just heard something intelligent and surprising. The Duke's jaw tightened. Duke's jaw. He set down the broken stem of his glass with deliberate care, the base still intact, the stem jagged where it had snapped under pressure he had not consciously applied. The young noblewoman beside him touched his sleeve. "Your Grace, are you injured?" He shook his head. "No." His voice was steady. He turned to her with the expression he used for social obligations, polite and distant. She smiled with relief that the moment had passed. The Duke returned his attention to his plate, but he did not eat. He watched Agnes from the corner of his eye, watched the way she gestured when she spoke, the way Philip listened with the attention of a man who genuinely wanted to hear what she had to say, the way the other guests at the lower table had begun to lean in, drawn by the authority in her voice. Mrs. Parr returned to the sideboard with the basin of broken glass. She caught the eye of the footman and gestured toward the Duke's wine glass, and the footman brought a replacement. The Duke accepted it without acknowledgement. He lifted the glass, but did not drink. His hand was steady. The glass did not break, but his gaze remained on Agnes, and Mrs. Parr, who had served the Thornfield estate for 30 years, recognized the look of a man who had just realized he had lost something he had assumed was permanent. The dinner continued. The second course was served, then the third. Agnes remained at the lower table, engaged in conversation with Philip and the 2 tenant representatives who had been invited as a gesture of the Duke's commitment to reform. The tenant representatives spoke to Agnes with the ease of men who had worked with her before, who knew her as the woman who read their petitions and drafted the responses, who organized the quarterly dinners and resolved disputes that might otherwise have festered into lawsuits. They did not speak to the Duke with the same ease. They spoke to him with deference, with the careful formality of men addressing a superior whose goodwill determined their livelihoods. Philip asked one of the tenant representatives about the new drainage system on the western fields, and the man replied that Mrs. Waring had suggested the modification after reviewing the soil reports. Philip turned to Agnes. "You reviewed the soil reports yourself?" She nodded. "Yes. The original proposal would have drained the lower field too quickly. The soil composition required a slower dispersal rate." Philip nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And the estate engineer agreed with your assessment?" "The estate engineer implemented my assessment," Agnes said. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not boastful, the tone of a woman stating a simple truth. The modification reduced erosion by 30% in the first season. Philip glanced toward the head of the table, where the Duke sat in conversation with the young noblewoman. Philip's gaze returned to Agnes. "Mrs. Waring, I would very much like to continue this conversation after dinner. I have been studying tenant reform programs across 3 counties, and the Thornfield model is the most effective I have encountered. I would be grateful for your insight." She smiled slightly. "Of course. I am happy to discuss the program." The Duke heard the exchange. He did not turn his head, but his hand tightened on his glass, and this time he noticed. He set the glass down before the stem could snap. He forced himself to engage with the young noblewoman beside him, to ask polite questions about her family's estate in Hampshire, to listen to her answers with the appearance of attention. But he heard every word Agnes spoke to Philip, every question Philip asked, every answer Agnes gave with the confidence of a woman who knew the program better than anyone else in the room, because she had built it. When the dinner ended, the guests rose and moved toward the drawing room. Philip offered Agnes his arm, and she accepted. The Duke watched them walk together, watched the way Philip leaned his head toward Agnes to hear something she said, watched the way Agnes gestured with her free hand as she explained something the Duke could not hear. The young noblewoman touched the Duke's sleeve again, drawing his attention, and he escorted her toward the drawing room with the mechanical courtesy of a man whose mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Parr began directing the staff to clear the table. She paused beside the Duke's chair and looked at the broken glass stem still resting on the tablecloth. She picked it up carefully, holding it by the base, and carried it to the sideboard. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The Duke knew what the broken glass meant. He had known the moment the stem snapped in his hand. He simply had not allowed himself to name it. The next morning, the Duke summoned Agnes to the estate office. The summons came in the form of a note delivered by a footman, written in the Duke's hand, brief and formal. "Mrs. Waring, I require your presence in the estate office at 10 o'clock. Thornfield." Agnes read the note at her cottage breakfast table, her tea cooling in its cup, and recognized the tone. She had received notes like this before, always when the Duke needed something: a letter drafted, a dispute mediated, a program detail clarified before a meeting with county officials. She folded the note and finished her tea. She dressed in a simple day gown, gray wool with a high collar, the kind of gown that signaled competence rather than beauty, and walked the half-mile from her cottage to the main house. The estate office was on the ground floor, adjacent to the library, a room lined with ledgers and maps and correspondence files that documented 3 generations of Thornfield estate management. Agnes had spent more hours in this room than in any other part of the house. More hours than she had spent in the drawing room or the dining room or the gallery where the Duke's ancestors gazed down from their portraits with expressions of aristocratic certainty. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. The Duke stood at the window, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn when she entered. "You wish to see me, Your Grace," Agnes said. She closed the door behind her and stood near the desk, her hands folded at her waist, her posture composed. The Duke turned. His expression was controlled, the expression he used during tenant meetings when a farmer challenged his authority, and he needed to reassert dominance without raising his voice. Sir Philip Calder seemed very interested in the tenant program last night. "He asked intelligent questions," Agnes said. "I answered them." "You discussed estate business with a stranger?" Agnes's gaze did not waver. "I discussed my work with a colleague." His mouth pressed into a thin line. "The tenant program is estate business, Mrs. Waring. It is not your work to discuss without my authorization." Agnes felt something shift in her chest, something that had been held in place by habit and deference, and the unexamined assumption that competence was its own reward. She drew a measured breath and met the Duke's eyes. "I have organized every quarterly dinner for 3 years. I have written every letter you signed regarding the program. I have mediated every dispute, reviewed every petition, and drafted every policy modification. If the program is not my work, Your Grace, then whose work is it?" What followed was not the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other. It was the hush of a man who had just heard a truth he could not refute, and a woman who had just claimed something she had never claimed aloud before. The Duke stared at Agnes, and Agnes held his gaze, and neither of them spoke. Finally, the Duke said, "The program belongs to the estate." "The estate belongs to me." She inclined her head slightly. "Yes, and the program was built by me. Those two things are both true, Your Grace. You may choose which one you prefer to acknowledge." She turned and walked to the door. She did not wait for his permission to leave. She opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and closed it behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than a slam. The Duke remained standing at the window, staring at the door Agnes had just closed, and for the first time in 3 years, he understood that the woman he had relied upon was not a permanent feature of his estate. She was a person, and she had just walked away. 2 days later, Sir Philip Calder sent a formal letter to Agnes's cottage. The letter was written on heavy paper, sealed with Philip's family crest, and delivered by a writer who waited for a reply. Agnes opened the letter at her kitchen table, her hands steady, and read Philip's precise handwriting. "Mrs. Waring, I have spent the past 2 days reviewing my notes from our conversation at Thornfield. The tenant program you have developed is the most comprehensive and effective model I have encountered in my study of estate reform. I am writing to invite you to consult on the establishment of a similar program on my Dorset estate. This would be a formal engagement, compensated at a rate commensurate with your expertise, and your contributions would be credited under your own name in all public documentation. I anticipate the initial consultation would require 3 weeks of residence at my estate, with the possibility of an ongoing advisory role thereafter. If you are willing to consider this proposal, I would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss the particulars at your earliest convenience. Yours in respect, Sir Philip Calder." Agnes read the letter twice. She set it down on the table and looked out the window at the garden she had planted when she moved into the cottage 5 years ago, after her husband's death. After the old Duchess had offered her a place on the estate boundary and a role in the tenant society that had given Agnes a purpose, when grief had threatened to erase her entirely. She thought about 3 years of writing letters the Duke signed. 3 years of organizing dinners where she sat beside him as an invisible architect. 3 years of watching men present her work as their own, because that was how the world functioned, and she had accepted it because acceptance was easier than confrontation. She picked up her pen and wrote a reply on a single sheet of paper. "Sir Philip, I accept your invitation. I am available to begin the consultation at the end of the month. Please send the particulars of the engagement at your convenience. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Agnes Waring. She sealed the letter and gave it to the waiting rider. She watched him ride down the lane toward the main road, and she felt something unfamiliar and powerful settle in her chest. It was not defiance. It was not anger. It was the quiet, steady certainty of a woman who had just chosen herself. Mrs. Parr learned of Agnes's acceptance within a day. The housekeeper had a network of information that extended across 3 counties, maintained through decades of correspondence with other housekeepers, stewards, and senior staff, who understood that knowledge was currency in a world where power was inherited and information was earned. Mrs. Parr brought the news to the Duke in the estate office that evening, entering without knocking because she had served the Thornfield family since the Duke was a boy, and had earned the privilege of familiarity. Mrs. Waring has accepted Sir Philip's invitation, Mrs. Parr said. She did not soften the statement with preamble or apology. She stood in front of the desk where the Duke was reviewing correspondence and delivered the information as fact. The Duke looked up. What invitation? Sir Philip has invited her to consult on his tenant program in Dorset. 3 weeks, compensated, with her name on the work. She accepted this afternoon. The Duke set down his pen. His expression did not change, but his hand remained on the desk, fingers curled against the wood. She accepted. Mrs. Parr nodded. Yes, Your Grace. When does she leave? End of the month. The Duke gave a slow nod. He picked up his pen again and returned his attention to the letter in front of him, a petition from a tenant regarding timber rights that he had read 3 times without absorbing a single word. Mrs. Parr remained standing in front of the desk, her hands folded at her waist, her gaze steady. Will that be all, Your Grace? She asked. He did not look up. Yes. Mrs. Parr turned to leave, then paused at the door. Your Grace, if I may. The Duke looked up. Mrs. Waring is a woman of considerable competence, Mrs. Parr said. She has given this estate 3 years of work that would have cost you 10 times her widow's jointure if you had hired a steward to do the same. Sir Philip is offering her something you have not. And what is that? The Duke asked. His voice was cold, the voice he used when a servant overstepped. Recognition, Mrs. Parr said. She did not flinch. He is offering her recognition, Your Grace, and she has accepted because no one else has offered it before. Mrs. Parr left before the Duke could respond. The door closed behind her, and the Duke sat alone in the estate office, staring at the petition he could not read, the pen motionless in his hand. That evening, the Duke appeared uninvited at a tenant meeting in the village hall. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks, a quarterly gathering where tenant representatives discussed program modifications and raised concerns that required estate attention. Agnes was presenting a proposal to expand the tenant fund to include emergency medical expenses, a modification she had been refining for months. She stood at the front of the hall, a sheaf of notes in her hand, addressing 20 tenant families with the calm authority of a woman who had earned their trust through competence and consistency. The Duke entered through the side door and stood at the back of the room. Agnes saw him immediately. Her gaze flickered toward him, registered his presence, and returned to the tenant in the front row who had just asked a question about fund allocation. She answered the question without hesitation, her voice steady, and continued her presentation as though the Duke of Thornfield had not just entered a meeting where his presence was neither expected nor required. The tenants noticed. They turned in their seats, glancing toward the Duke, their expressions uncertain. The Duke nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and remained standing at the back of the room with his arms folded across his chest. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He watched Agnes command the space he had always assumed belonged to him. Over the next 2 weeks, Sir Philip's presence at Thornfield became a quiet disruption. He attended tenant meetings, not as a guest, but as a colleague observing a model he intended to replicate. He asked questions directly to the tenant representatives, and they answered with the ease of men who had been encouraged to speak their minds. When Philip asked who had designed the dispute resolution process, the tenants named Agnes. When he asked who had proposed the fund expansion, they named Agnes again. The Duke heard his own invisibility spoken aloud, and he could not object without revealing that he had never been the architect in the first place. One afternoon, the Duke encountered Agnes and Philip in the corridor outside the estate office. They were standing near the window, reviewing a set of documents Philip had brought from Dorset. Their heads bent close together as Agnes pointed to a line of text and explained something the Duke could not hear. The Duke approached with deliberate footsteps, his boots loud on the stone floor, and both Agnes and Philip looked up. "Mrs. Waring," the Duke said, "you are needed in the drawing room." Agnes looked at him with an expression of polite inquiry. "For what purpose, Your Grace?" The Duke had not prepared an answer. He had invented the need in the moment, driven by the sight of Agnes standing close to Philip, speaking with the ease of two colleagues who respected each other's expertise. "Lady Ashford is calling," he said. "She wished to speak with you regarding the charity auction." Agnes's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, a recognition that the Duke was lying and that she knew he was lying. "Lady Ashford sent her regrets yesterday," Agnes said quietly. "She will not be calling this week." His shoulders stiffened. Philip glanced between them, his expression carefully neutral, and stepped back from the window. "I should return to my rooms," Philip said. "Mrs. Waring, thank you for your time. I will review these notes and send my questions in writing." She nodded. "Of course." She handed the documents back to Philip, and he left the corridor with a polite nod to the Duke. Agnes remained standing by the window, her hands folded at her waist, her gaze steady on the Duke's face. "You are not needed in the drawing room," the Duke said. His voice was low, meant only for her. Agnes met his eyes. "I know." "Then why did you correct me?" "Because you were not being truthful, Your Grace, and I will not pretend otherwise to spare your discomfort." The Duke stared at her, and Agnes held his gaze without flinching. The air between them grew taut, stretched thin, until the Duke turned and walked away, without another word. Agnes remained by the window, her hands steady, her heart beating hard against her ribs. 3 days later, the Duke attended a working session in the estate office, where Agnes was meeting with 2 tenant representatives to finalize the fund expansion proposal. The Duke had not been invited. He entered the room as the meeting was beginning, took a seat near the door, and said nothing. Agnes glanced at him once, registered his presence, and continued the meeting as though he were not there. One of the tenant representatives, a man named Thorne who farmed the northern fields, raised a concern about the proposed contribution rate. "Some of the smaller tenants are worried the increase will strain their margins," Thorne said. "They support the expansion, but they need assurance the rate will not rise again next year." Agnes inclined her head. "The rate is fixed for 3 years. That commitment is written into the proposal. If costs exceed projections, the estate will cover the shortfall, not the tenants." Thorne looked toward the Duke. "Is that acceptable to His Grace?" The Duke realized, with a jolt of discomfort, that the question was not rhetorical. Thorne was asking because he did not assume the Duke had already agreed. The Duke met Agnes's gaze across the room. She watched him with the same calm composure she had used in the corridor, waiting for his answer. and the Duke understood that she had not consulted him before making the commitment. His voice was level. "Yes, the estate will cover any shortfall." Thorn nodded, satisfied, and returned his attention to Agnes. The meeting continued. When a second tenant representative challenged a detail of the medical expense criteria, the Duke stood and crossed the room. He stopped behind Agnes's chair and placed his hand at the small of her back, a gesture of support that was also a public claim. Agnes stiffened slightly, but did not pull away. She answered the tenant's question with the same precision she always used, and the meeting concluded with the proposal approved. After the tenants left, Agnes remained seated at the desk, reviewing her notes. The Duke stood behind her chair, his hand still resting lightly at her back. Agnes set down her pen and turned her head to look at him. You did not need to do that," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "I know." Agnes stood, stepping away from his hand, and gathered her notes into a folder. "The proposal is complete. I will have the final draft ready for your signature by the end of the week." "Agnes," the Duke said. Her name sounded strange in his mouth, unfamiliar after 3 years of calling her Mrs. Waring in every context, public and private. She looked at him, waiting. "Do not go to Dorset," the Duke said. Agnes's expression did not change. "Why not?" The Duke could not answer. He did not have the words for what he felt, did not have the language to explain why the thought of Agnes leaving made his chest tighten with something that felt like panic. He stared at her, and Agnes held his gaze for a long moment before turning away. "I leave at the end of the month," she said. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and glanced back at him. "You have 2 weeks to determine why you want me to stay, Your Grace. I suggest you use them." She left. The Duke remained standing in the estate office, alone, staring at the door she had just closed. The annual report was due in 10 days. The report was a formal document presented to the County Council each year, summarizing the Thornfield Tenant Program's activities, finances, and outcomes. For 3 years, the report had been written by Agnes and signed by the Duke, with a title page that listed the Duke of Thornfield as the program's director and architect. This year, Agnes submitted a version with a different title page. The new page listed the program's actual contributors: Mrs. Agnes Waring, Program Director; Mrs. Eliza Parr, Administrative Liaison; Mr. John Thorne, Tenant Representative; Mr. David Carr, Tenant Representative. The Duke's name appeared at the bottom in smaller text, under the patronage of His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. The Duke received the draft from Mr. Collis, the estate steward, who delivered it to the estate office with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. The Duke read the title page twice. He set the report down on the desk and looked at Collis. "This is incorrect," the Duke said. "Mrs. Waring submitted it this morning," Collis said. "She indicated it reflects the actual structure of the program." "Change it back," Collis hesitated. "Your Grace, the tenant representatives have already seen the original version. Mrs. Waring shared it with them last week for their approval." The Duke's hand stilled on the desk. "She shared it with the tenants." Collis nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duke stared at the title page, at Agnes's name in bold text at the top, at his own name relegated to a line of patronage at the bottom. He thought about 3 years of signing letters he had not written, 3 years of accepting credit for work he had not done, 3 years of assuming Agnes's labor was infrastructure rather than achievement. He thought about Philip asking Agnes questions and Agnes answering with authority, about tenants naming Agnes as the architect, about Agnes standing in front of a room full of farmers and commanding their attention without effort. "Change it," the Duke said. His voice was flat. Collis nodded. He took the report and left the office. The Duke sat alone at the desk, staring at the space where the report had been, and understood that the truth was no longer in his control. Agnes had not leaked it. She had simply stopped hiding it. Agnes did not return to the estate office after the report incident. She remained at her cottage, tending her garden, reading, preparing for her departure to Dorset. The quarterly dinner, scheduled for the following week, began to collapse without her. There was no seating chart, no agenda. 2 tenant disputes that had been simmering for weeks went unresolved because no one else knew the details well enough to mediate. Mrs. Parr did what she could, but she was a housekeeper, not a program director, and the tenants knew the difference. 3 days before the dinner, the Duke went to Agnes's cottage uninvited. He walked the half-mile from the main house in the late afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain, and found Agnes in her garden, pruning lavender with a pair of small shears. She looked up when he opened the gate, registered his presence, and returned her attention to the lavender without greeting him. The Duke stood at the edge of the garden path, his hands at his sides, and watched her work. Agnes moved with the same precision she used in everything, cutting each stem at the same angle, laying the cuttings in a basket at her feet. Nothing but the sound of the shears and the distant call of a crow in the oak tree at the garden's edge filled the air between them. "The program needs you," the Duke said finally. Agnes did not look up. "The program has functioned without me for 3 days. It will continue to function. The quarterly dinner is in disarray. Then you will need to organize it yourself, Your Grace." The Duke took a step closer. "Agnes." She set down the shears and stood, turning to face him. Her hands were stained with lavender oil. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked at him with an expression that was not anger, not defiance, but something quieter and more devastating: indifference. "The program needs me," Agnes said. "Do you know the difference between the program needing me and you needing me, Your Grace?" The Duke stared at her. He could not answer. He did not know how to separate the two, did not know how to articulate the difference between needing her competence and needing her presence, between valuing her work and valuing her. Agnes picked up her basket of lavender cuttings. "I think you should leave." "Agnes," her voice was soft but unyielding. "Please, leave." The Duke turned and walked to the gate. He stopped with his hand on the iron latch and looked back at her. Agnes had returned to her pruning, her back to him, her shears moving with steady precision. The Duke opened the gate and left. He walked back to the main house in the gathering dusk, and when he reached the estate office, he sat at the desk and stared at the wall until the light faded entirely. That night, the Duke sat alone in the estate office and read 3 years of Agnes's correspondence. The letters were filed in chronological order, each one written in her precise handwriting, each one signed with his name. He read her solutions to tenant disputes, her proposals for program modifications, her careful phrasing in letters to county officials who needed to be persuaded rather than commanded. He read her voice, her intelligence, her patience, and he saw for the first time the architecture of his own theft. It had not been cruelty. It had been habit. It had been the unexamined assumption that the program belonged to the estate, and the estate belonged to him, and therefore everything Agnes built was his by extension. He had valued her the way one valued an excellent steward, necessary and competent and invisible. He had never asked what she wanted. He had never considered that she might want something other than the privilege of serving his estate without recognition. The next morning, a formal contract arrived from Sir Philip Calder, delivered by Ryder to Agnes's cottage. The contract outlined the terms of the Dorset consultation: 3 weeks of residence, a salary that exceeded Agnes's widow's jointure by half, and a provision that all program documentation would credit her by name. Agnes read the contract at her kitchen table, her tea cooling beside her, and signed it without hesitation. Mrs. Parr visited the Duke that afternoon in the estate office. She entered without knocking, as she always did, and stood in front of the desk with her hands folded. "Mrs. Waring signed Sir Philip's contract this morning," Mrs. Parr said. The Duke looked up from the letter he was writing. "I see. Your Grace, you are behaving like a man who has lost something." "I have not lost anything, Mrs. Parr." "Then you are behaving like a man who is about to." Mrs. Parr's gaze was steady, her voice calm. "You might consider what it is before it is too late to name it." She left before he could respond. The Duke sat alone at the desk, staring at the half-written letter. And for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to name what he felt. It was not the loss of Agnes's competence. It was not the inconvenience of her absence. It was the loss of her. The woman who had sat beside him for 3 years, who had built something extraordinary in the shadow of his name, who had laughed at another man's joke and had not noticed when the Duke's hand tightened on his glass until the stem snapped. The night before the midsummer ball, the Duke found Agnes at her cottage gate. She was standing with her hands gripping the iron bars, staring at the lane that led toward the main road, her shoulders tense. The Duke did not announce himself. He simply walked up behind her and covered her hands with his. Agnes stiffened, then slowly relaxed, leaning back against his chest. The Duke rested his chin at her temple, and they stood together in the gathering darkness, neither speaking. Agnes's hand stopped trembling beneath his. After a long moment, Agnes said quietly, "What are you doing here?" "I do not know," the Duke said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "I only know I could not stay away." Agnes turned in his arms, stepping back so she could see his face. "You have 2 days to decide what you want, Your Grace. After that, I leave for Dorset." "I know what I want," the Duke said. "Do you?" Agnes's gaze searched his face. "Or do you only know what you are about to lose?" The Duke could not answer. Agnes stepped away, out of his arms, and walked back to her cottage. She did not look back. The Duke remained standing at the gate, his hands gripping the iron where hers had been, and watched the light in her window until it went dark. The midsummer ball was the largest social event of the Thornfield calendar, an annual gathering that drew 300 guests from across the county. The ballroom was lit with 1,000 candles, the tables draped in white linen, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hum of conversation. Agnes arrived in a gown of deep blue silk, her hair pinned in an elegant twist, and stood near the terrace doors with a glass of wine she did not drink. Philip found her within minutes, offering his arm and his steady, uncomplicated presence. "You look well, Mrs. Waring," Philip said. She smiled faintly. "Thank you." She allowed him to lead her toward the center of the room where other guests were gathering. The Duke stood at the far end of the ballroom, near the musicians' platform, holding a sheaf of papers bound in leather. He had not danced. He had not greeted his guests with the usual warmth. He had stood alone, watching Agnes move through the room with Philip at her side. And he had made a decision. At 9:30, the Duke stepped onto the musicians' platform and raised his hand. The music stopped. The guests turned toward him, their conversations fading into expectant silence. The Duke looked across the room and found Agnes standing near the terrace doors, Philip beside her, her expression carefully composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke said. His voice carried across the ballroom, steady and clear. "I have an announcement regarding the Thornfield tenant program." The guests murmured with polite interest. The Duke opened the leather binding and held up the original report, the one with Agnes's name at the top of the title page. "This is the annual report for the Thornfield tenant program," the Duke said. "For 3 years, I have presented this report under my own name, accepting credit for work I did not do. The program you have heard praised, the reforms you have seen implemented, the success you have attributed to my leadership, none of it was mine." The murmuring stopped. The ballroom was silent. Agnes's hands tightened on her wine glass. "Philip, this is yours," the Duke said. "It has always been yours. I am placing it in your hands, before these witnesses, and I am stating publicly what should have been acknowledged 3 years ago. The Thornfield tenant program belongs to you, Mrs. Waring. You built it, you sustained it, and I have no right to claim it." Agnes took the report with trembling hands. She looked down at the title page, at her own name in bold text, and felt something break open in her chest, something that had been held closed by years of silence and deference, and the unexamined belief that competence was supposed to be its own reward. She looked up at the Duke, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed him to see the full weight of what his recognition meant. Her voice was barely audible. "Thank you." The Duke nodded once. He turned and walked back across the ballroom, leaving Agnes standing with the report in her hands and 300 guests staring at her. Philip leaned close and said, "That was well done." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it was." She left the ballroom and walked onto the terrace, needing air, needing space to breathe. The night was warm, the sky clear, the gardens beyond the terrace lit with lanterns that swayed gently in the breeze. Agnes set the report on the stone balustrade and gripped the edge with both hands, her chest tight, her breath coming fast. The Duke appeared beside her a moment later. He did not speak. He simply stood at the balustrade, his hands folded, his gaze on the gardens. Agnes glanced at him, then returned her attention to the lanterns. "You read the original page?" Agnes said finally. He inclined his head. "Yes." "Philip asked me to come to Dorset," Agnes said. "Build a program under my own name. 3 weeks, compensated, with full credit." His expression tightened. "Will you go?" "I have not decided." "What would help you decide?" Agnes turned to face him. "Being asked what I want, not what I can do for someone." The Duke met her gaze. "What do you want, Agnes?" It was the first time he had asked. Agnes felt the question settle in her chest, heavy and real, and she drew a careful breath before answering. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when you are not afraid of the answer." The Duke stared at her, and she saw the fear in his eyes, saw the uncertainty of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted and did not know how to ask for something he could not claim. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them, and raised his hand to her jaw, his touch careful, his fingers warm against her skin. "I am afraid," the Duke said. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "I am asking anyway." Agnes closed the distance. She kissed him, and the Duke's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, his grip firm but not possessive, the grip of a man who understood that holding on required permission. Agnes's hands rose to his shoulders, and she kissed him with the full weight of 3 years of silence and competence, and the quiet, unspoken hope that someday someone would ask what she wanted, instead of what she could give. When they finally pulled apart, the Duke rested his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, his hand still at her waist. He spoke softly. "Stay. Please, Agnes. Stay." "I will consider it," Agnes said. Her voice was soft but firm. "But I will not stay as your invisible architect, Your Grace. If I stay, it is as myself, with my name on the work, with my voice in the decisions. Do you understand?" His answer came without hesitation. "Yes, I understand." Agnes stepped back, out of his arms, and picked up the report from the balustrade. She held it against her chest, her gaze steady on his face. "I leave for Dorset in 2 days. I will return in 3 weeks. If you still want me to stay when I return, you may ask me then. And if I ask now, then I will tell you the same thing I told you a moment ago," Agnes said. "Ask me when you are not afraid of the answer." She walked past him, back into the ballroom, and the Duke remained on the terrace, alone, staring at the gardens and the swaying lanterns and the space where Agnes had stood. 2 weeks later, the Duke knocked at the estate office door before entering. It was the first time he had knocked at his own office door in his entire life. Agnes was seated at the desk, writing the quarterly report under her own name, her handwriting filling the page with the same precision she had always used. She looked up when the door opened, and a small smile crossed her face. "You knocked," she said. "It is your office," the Duke said. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I should have knocked 3 years ago." Agnes set down her pen. "Yes, you should have." The Duke crossed the room and stood beside the desk, his hands at his sides, his gaze on the report she was writing. "How was Dorset?" "Productive," Agnes said. "Philip's program is well designed. He listens to his tenants. He will do well." "And did he ask you to stay?" Agnes looked up at him, her expression calm. "He did." His expression tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would consider it," Agnes said, "but that I had unfinished business at Thornfield." The Duke exhaled slowly. He pulled a chair close to the desk and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. "Agnes, I have spent the past 2 weeks reading every letter you wrote, every proposal you drafted, every solution you created. I have seen the architecture of what you built, and I have seen the architecture of my own blindness. I do not have the words to apologize for 3 years of taking credit for your work. But I am asking, not assuming, not claiming, I am asking if you will stay. Not as my steward, not as my invisible architect, as my partner, in the program, and in everything else." Agnes was silent for a long moment. She looked at the report on the desk, and at her name written at the top in bold letters. And then she looked at the Duke. "If I stay," she said slowly, "the program keeps my name." His response was immediate. "Yes." "And I make the decisions regarding program policy." "Yes." "And if we disagree, we discuss it as equals, not as patron and subordinate." "Yes." Agnes leaned back in her chair, her gaze searching his face. "You understand what you are agreeing to, Your Grace?" "I understand that I am agreeing to see you," the Duke said, "as you have always been, as I should have seen you from the beginning." Agnes smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Then yes, I will stay." The Duke exhaled, his shoulders relaxing, and he reached across the desk to take her hand. Agnes allowed it, her fingers curling around his, and they sat together in the estate office that was now hers, the afternoon light streaming through the window, the quarterly report waiting to be finished under her name. Autumn arrived with cool winds and golden light that turned the Thornfield Gardens into a tapestry of amber and rust. Agnes read the County Gazette at her cottage table one morning in late September. The pages spread before her, her tea steaming in its cup. The Gazette's front page carried a headline that made her pause. Thornfield Tenant Program recognized by County Council. The article beneath the headline was brief but clear. The Thornfield Tenant Program, designed and administered by Mrs. Agnes Waring under the patronage of the Duke of Thornfield, has been recognized by the County Council as a model for estate reform. Mrs. Waring's innovative approach to tenant welfare and dispute resolution has drawn interest from estates across 3 counties. The program's success is attributed to Mrs. Waring's leadership and the Duke of Thornfield's commitment to supporting tenant welfare through effective patronage. Agnes set down the Gazette and looked across the table at the Duke, who was seated in the chair opposite hers, reading a letter from the County Council that had arrived that morning. He glanced up and saw her watching him. The Gazette used the word patronage, Agnes said. He nodded. Yes, that is what I am. Agnes smiled. I noticed they did not use the word director. That title belongs to you, the Duke said. He set down the letter and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on her face. As it should. Agnes picked up her tea and took a slow sip, her expression thoughtful. The Duke watched her, and after a moment, he stood and crossed to her side of the table. He knelt beside her chair, his hand resting on the armrest, his gaze level with hers. Agnes, he said quietly, I was hoping for a different title. Agnes set down her tea. Which title? Yours, the Duke said. He took her hand in his thumb brushing across her knuckles. I am asking, not assuming, not signing my name to something you built. I am asking if you will marry me, Agnes Waring, and allow me the privilege of being yours. Agnes looked down at their joined hands, at the man kneeling beside her chair, at the vulnerability in his eyes that he had learned to show her over the months since the midsummer ball. She thought about 3 years of silence, about the glass that snapped in his hand, about the night he stood behind her at the cottage gate and covered her hands with his. She thought about the title page with her name in bold letters, about the quarterly dinners she now organized under her own authority, about the program she had built and the recognition she had earned. Her voice was steady, certain, warm. Yes, but the program keeps my name. The Duke smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. I would not dare. He stood and pulled her to her feet, his hands at her waist, and kissed her with the careful tenderness of a man who had learned that asking was stronger than claiming, that recognition was more valuable than control, that love required seeing the person you held rather than the role they filled. Agnes kissed him back, her hands rising to his shoulders, and when they finally pulled apart, the autumn sunlight streamed through the cottage window and lit the room with gold. Outside, the Thornfield Gardens stretched toward the horizon, the tenant cottages dotting the landscape, the estate thriving under the program Agnes had built and the partnership she had chosen. The County Gazette lay open on the table, her name printed in bold letters for anyone to read. And the Duke of Thornfield stood in her cottage, in her space, asking to be hers. Agnes had spent her entire life being competent for other people's benefit. She had been a baron's daughter, a baron's wife, a duke's invisible architect. But now, standing in her cottage with the man who had finally learned to see her, she was simply Agnes Waring, program director, reformer, partner. And that was enough.